educator can name that one moment, the moment a student surprises them, challenges them, or reminds them why this work matters. For us, those moments didn't just shape our careers, they shaped this podcast. Behind because behind every schedule, every educational environment, every policy, every initiative, there are real people, real stories, real futures at stake.
And this podcast begins in that space where research meets real life, where theory gets its hands dirty, and where practice turns ideas into impact and meaningful opportunities for all learners. Welcome to Enlightened Practitioners, the podcast where we will be illuminating the stories, research, and lived experiences that are transforming education from the inside out. So if you care about meaningful change in education and beyond, you're in the right place, and you've just found your community.
Hi, I'm Dr. Julie DiPilato.
And I'm Dr. Jonathan Page, and we are so excited to welcome you to episode 1.
Today, we want to introduce ourselves and to provide the foundation for what brought us here, the experiences, questions, and challenges that convinced us this conversation is not just timely, but necessary.
Absolutely. And so, Julie, I think a great place for us to begin is with this basic question that people have been asking us for quite a while, which is, why launch a podcast for practitioners now? How do you respond?
That's a great question, and we do hear it a lot. I think the reason behind it really is that we keep meeting educators through our doctoral journey, through our own work experiences, conferences that we go to, who know that belonging matters, but doesn't necessarily know how to build systems that actually deliver it. Because students are telling us what they need, and too often the system isn't set up to listen. And because middle school, my favorite topic, is one of the most powerful under-leveraged windows for shaping purpose and possibility. So we are going to be focusing on more than just middle school, but you will often hear me refer to middle school because that is my passion.
Absolutely. And I add my little piece of loving that secondary education and, especially higher education.
Right.
But I'll also add that we both saw that too many conversations about inclusion, about access and equity stayed in that theoretical realm. But we want to talk about the real work, that messy work, that, as you and I have seen, the real work, the human work. And we want to be able to explore, the issues and also really spotlight the people who are doing some extraordinary things and some of the phenomenal work being done in these educational spaces.
Absolutely. So let's introduce ourselves a little. Jonathan, your pathway into leadership is one of my favorites because it is not linear. What part of your journey feels most connected to this podcast?
I think so much. I mean, you're right. When I think of my educational journey, it was circuitous. I sort of fell into education quite by accident. It's never my intention, to be an educator, but here I am nearly 30 years later, living the dream. I started out as a secondary English teacher, then transitioned into higher ed as a faculty member, and then a student affairs professional. But at every step, my work has really centered on one primary thing, and that's on student growth and development, because I've really always believed that our role as educators isn't simply to mold students into who we think they should be, but to meet them where they are and help to guide them toward who they want to become. I think in a lot of this work for me is grounded in the fact that I never really felt like I belonged, in a lot of spaces. And I didn't have, a lot of folks who sort of mentored me along the way. My guiding principle has been, how can I create these spaces of belonging, and how can I be, that guide, that mentor that I always wish I had at that point. And so I'm deeply interested in how identity then goes on to shape both the way that students and educators really experience education, and how culture, background, and lived experience influence belonging, confidence, leadership, and success. And a big part of the work really has been helping people see themselves authentically. And we come back to that word a lot, that notion of authenticity within systems that they're a part of, to recognize their value, their voice, their agency, even when those systems weren't originally designed with them in mind. And that's what pushed, I think, us, to really think about transformative change agency, because that's something that was strongly emphasized throughout our doctoral journey at Northeastern, so that we could create those equitable, inclusive, and accessible environments, and to work towards dismantling those systemic barriers that too often stand in the way of so many of our students. And so for me, connection and belonging aren't just buzzwords, they're essential. They are critical to our existence and to our success, because representation matters, language matters, and relationships matter. Policies and practices matter. And this podcast really grows out of that lifelong commitment to developing, challenging, supporting, and empowering learners and educators.
Absolutely. And for me, mine started back when I was in middle school and actually even younger in elementary school. I was not one that had an academic identity. I did not see
Mm-hmm.
myself as a learner. I was a
Mm-hmm.
super hard worker. I worked from when I was very young at my parents' restaurants, many, many hours. I could do hard work,
Mm-hmm.
but academic work, just I didn't understand it. It wasn't until I was an adult and my kids were in middle school that I realized that I had undiagnosed ADHD.
Mm-hmm.
And here I am in school, sitting in my classes, but I'm off somewhere else thinking about other things. And the class ends and are talking about what was in class, and I have not a clue. So
Mm-hmm.
to me, my brain was broken. I was stupid. I didn't
Mm-hmm.
understand how to learn. And that's how I saw myself. And it really wasn't until my high school years when I had Mr. Brooks as a physics teacher that
Mm-hmm.
we were looking at equations and he goes, "You just don't understand fractions. Let me explain them to you." And it was like a light bulb going off. The whole, like all of a sudden, the equation made sense. He took the
Mm-hmm.
time to help me to build up my confidence, to allow me to be who I was, be
Mm-hmm.
proud of who I was,
Mm-hmm.
and show me that everyone is capable of learning. Now, didn't go into college to be an educator, ended up in the
Mm-hmm.
business world for many years. But then I realized that my calling really is to help students. And
Mm-hmm.
middle school was that time where I really started to not feel good about myself in many
Mm-hmm.
senses, but especially academic. So that
Mm-hmm.
was my focus. And my focus became I wanted to be the Mr. Brooks for my students. I didn't
Mm-hmm.
want my students to hopefully get a teacher in the future that made them feel as though they belonged, showed them that
Mm-hmm.
they can learn, gave opportunities besides, what I grew up in my little microcosm family of restaurant. You could do other things. Um, and that really is that's my true calling to teaching
Mm-hmm.
was making sure that every student feels as though they belong, feels as though they can learn, and build their confidence and allow them to see their future, give them
Absolutely.
opportunities to go into the future. So belonging really is the heartbeat of everything. And part of belonging is making those connections that you were talking about. So when students feel they belong, they engage more deeply. They
Mm-hmm.
take academic risks. They actually
Definitely.
see their future. So to me, my experience as it relates to the podcast is I see this podcast as our place to explore how educators can create those conditions intentionally, not as an add on, but truly create a culture that allows students to be themselves, see their future, and grow not only academically, but emotionally, and feel successful. So that's my connection to the podcast.
Absolutely. And just kind of hearing you say that really makes me think even more about those impacts and benefits of belonging. You mentioned a few of them, but I've seen in higher ed how belonging really has an impact on retention, that
Oh, absolutely.
students are going to persist. They are going to come back. They are going to sort of develop that sense of resilience because they've made a connection. We see that academic performance
Mm,
improves. We know that engagement and involvement in campus life and activities improve. And one of the pieces that I think is really, sort of undervalued with belonging is really that sense of overall mental health and well-being, which we're seeing is extremely critical, in today's educational environment. But we could go
Absolutely.
on for this
Oh,
here for a long time. So let's kind of put a little teaser out there. Let's give
yes,
our listeners a preview. What can they expect
absolutely.
from season one from us?
So I think the first thing you're going to hear is belonging. We're going to
Hmm.
talk about belonging, identity, social capital, and how it shapes those student outcomes. Because what you're saying is happening in higher ed when people
Hmm.
feel belonging happens in the middle school as well. It happens pre-K to 20. If you feel you belong, you are more invested. So
Hmm.
you're going to hear us talk about that a lot this year. Um, I'm going to be probably bringing up middle school often while you're bringing up the higher ed. Um,
Hmm.
because when I'm thinking middle school, it's an opportunity for us to get future readiness so that students can go on to higher ed or other training. Um, we want to make sure that we're supporting students that have a broader intellectual profile, and we're not
Hmm.
just looking at that middle of the road or AP kid. We're looking at all students, those with disabilities, with neurodivergencies, and
Hmm.
we're making sure that we're inclusive of everyone because everyone should feel as though they belong and everyone can learn in their own way. And there's no way that we should be stopping that. We're going to talk about and hear stories from educators that are transforming their systems and
Hmm.
researchers. We're going to talk about, you said it earlier, how research actually bridges classroom practice. How do we take that messiness of the research? How do we get it into the student's lived experience? And have honest conversations along the way and about different things that can get in the way of education or are getting in the way of education and how we can overcome that together. So it's a place for us to have a great conversation.
Absolutely. And what excites me as well is, just how our plan is to really talk about a lot of these educational policies, thinking
Mhm.
about issues like AI, artificial intelligence, and how
Absolutely.
it is going to change and impact the educational landscape. Plus, we're going to hear from leaders who are building what we are calling future focused systems, not
Hmm.
compliance driven, not surface level, but those deeply intentional systems and cultures where the needs of students and stakeholders are central to the mission.
Absolutely. So we've been throwing the word belonging out a lot here.
Hmm.
Can you take a moment? Because a lot of times when people think of belonging, it's misunderstood, like the
Right.
definition of. Can you just take a moment and share what we're talking about in belonging, just so that all of our listeners can kind of be on that same page, um, and be part of the conversation with us?
Yeah, absolutely. Shout out to Dr. Terrell Strayhorn and all the work that he's done in sense of belonging theory. A lot of the work that I do is based in a lot of his scholarship, and research. But when we talk about belonging, really what we are talking about is the way that people feel when they are in these spaces. It's that perceived sense of social support that they have, of connectedness with others, and feeling that they actually matter, within a community. And I don't think we can and truly really undervalue this notion of feeling cared about and accepted and respected and seen and heard and valued. Belonging really allows us to be, our authentic self without necessarily needing to change or hide who we are in order to get along. It's that notion of, and we're going to talk about this, throughout the season of, fitting in versus belonging, because I know you've done a lot, in that space. So belonging truly is feeling welcomed and feeling affirmed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that brings me back, of course, my middle school brain. I'm thinking of those students in middle school. Lots of times I get called crazy because I'm a middle school teacher, all the hormones and everything, right? But that's when students are trying to figure out, who am I? Who am I going to become? Who believes in me? And what do I have access to do? And it's so different for so many different students depending on their families and their lived experiences. They don't have the same social capital as some other
Hmm.
students. So this this work, especially, at the middle school level, I think of those kids, instead of having them fit in
Hmm.
and code switching becoming what the norm is, we want to create a place where they actually can explore who they really are so that they can become their true authentic self. And that's, to me, that's what this work is so important about. And that's why this work matters, because these young adolescents are building their future selves in real time. So when I'm
Hmm.
thinking of my space where I live in all the time, a lot of the students have very limited social capital for a myriad of different reasons. This is not
Hmm.
just social economic, it's not race, it's not sexual orientation. It's just their experiences that can limit sometimes those social capital experiences that they really need. And by bringing this into the school, we're taking it, allowing everything to be happening at home, but we're also making it equitable so
Hmm.
that this is inclusive and equitable, and every student gets this opportunity to find who they truly are and see their future self. So schools become that ecosystem where
Hmm.
we allow the possibility to expand instead of students closing doors on themselves and just playing school just to get through so that
Yeah.
they can start their life.
Absolutely. Again, shout out to Dr. Tara Yasso, on the work that she's
Oh,
done with community
mhm.
cultural wealth, which also has gone to really inform, our understanding and a lot of the work that we do. But as I hear you talk, I also think about that connection between belonging and opportunity. And the
Definitely.
beautiful thing about this notion of being an enlightened practitioner, is that it transcends that traditional pre-K through 20 academic and educational space to include even what's happening in the world of workplace learning.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because we want to make sure that our students know that they can be and do anything they want to be, and that they can be authentic to themselves while doing that. So connection is huge. So we keep throwing around this enlightened practitioner, uh,
Hmm.
this phrase. So for our listeners out there, if you're not used to these type of educational um, words or buzzwords that we use a lot, um, it's really someone who is reflective, equity centered, future
Hmm.
focused, and is willing to rethink the way that things have always been done. Someone who sees students not just as data points. We're not looking at subgroups, we're not looking at individuals, but really as emerging identities with their own stories and their own strengths that they are bringing to the table. So that really truly is what this podcast is about. And that's what an enlightened practitioner is.
Absolutely. And I think what you'll hear us say, over and over again, you'll hear us use the words transformative, and you'll hear
Absolutely.
us use the words change agency,
Hmm.
because that's really a part of being that enlightened practitioner as well. And I think at the heart of it for me, an enlightened practitioner is someone who knows that the idea of belonging isn't a soft concept.
No,
No, in fact, it's the opposite. It's powerful, it's academic, and it's absolutely transformative.
100% agree. So, one thing I would love to mention is that if you ever have questions about some of the buzzwords we are using in education, just let
Mhm.
us know because we're talking with each other. We've got all these great educational buzzwords, but just let us know and we are happy to explain those to you. So drop us an email and we can get back to you.
Absolutely. And don't be afraid to ask us for resources about any of the topics that we discuss.
Absolutely, because we're here to have the conversations to enlighten people and for you to enlighten us, because this is a space where we're all learning. Absolutely. So, in our next episodes, we're going to be hearing from incredible guests, from researchers, practitioners, and leaders whose work is really reshaping what is possible in education. So, we're so excited to have you join us for our upcoming episodes.
Absolutely. We are excited and cannot wait to share these conversations with you because we really have some truly amazing guests who are going to share the work that they do.
Absolutely. So, if today's episode resonated with you, share it with a colleague, school leaders, family members, friends, anyone who might be interested in learning more about education, how the system works, and ways in which we can make impacts as change makers. Be sure
Mhm.
to like and follow us so that you never miss an episode.
Absolutely. And remember, we're building a community that recognizes and values the point that education truly is that silver bullet, and that every learner deserves to have that sense of belonging, of inclusion, of equity, of access, of purpose, and possibility. And that every educator has a duty to help to create that. We're about sparking, yeah, we we are about sparking that sense of curiosity to, as educators, always ask that question, why not, as
Absolutely.
opposed to why.
Absolutely. So thanks everyone for joining us for episode 1 of Enlightened Practitioners. Let's keep illuminating what education can become.
See you next time.